people would know who you guys are, but we've got some new people attending as well. So maybe Mike, from your end, if you would, just introduce yourself and your affiliation and your favorite ice cream flavor.
It's exciting. So I'm Mike Bany. I work for Fox Corporation again. I am currently, my title is Vice President of Broadcast Technology. My job is to work with the owned TV stations at Fox and Fox News to help with future broadcast technologies like IP, that type of thing, and with InfoSec also.
Hi, I'm Karl Paulsen, Chief Technology Officer at Diversified. We are a little company that puts IP systems together among 10,000 other things on a regular basis. My role in the company really is to keep ahead of the advanced technologies, keep our lead engineers and our sales department in line with what's going on, and a lot of other things.
Hi, Andy Rayner. My favorite ice cream is ginger, I think.
Oh man, that's totally good.
Yeah, I'm Chief Technologist for Nevion, which is now part of the bigger Sony family. In case you hadn't guessed or didn't already know, I'm UK based, and there's an ongoing offer for a cup of tea if you're ever in the UK, which I will reiterate in the next couple of days at different times as well. So I love a nice cup of tea as well, but I'm responsible for technology architecture and technology evangelism for our company.
Thank you. I'm John Myatt. I'm the CTO and Product Management Director at Imagine Communications. We make stuff. My favorite ice cream is Ginger Snap Molasses from Toscanini's in Boston.
That's very specific.
Oh, that is. It's very specific, but I like that.
Wow. I was just going to say coffee. Boy, I feel so inadequate now. I don't know. Richard Friedel, most of you probably know me as Fox, but the official title is now retired, which I'm told means consultant. I will be speaking today, though, mostly about my experience at Fox, obviously, and in particular the station Brad mentioned earlier, the launch of WTTG in Washington, D.C.
Great. And my favorite, see, I kind of put all that together. My favorite flavor of ice cream is a really good vanilla ice cream.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, just stick with the basics, right? So I think the starting point for this panel is to ask the question, how's the transition from focusing on developing IP-based equipment, kind of in the 2110 NMOS ecosystem world, to focusing on building systems out of that equipment going. But behind that, of course, is an assumption that we're actually at that point, meaning that 2110 NMOS equipment is now readily available, and the real kind of cold face of the work that's going on now is on building systems out of that equipment. So rather than just taking that as a plus, I think my first question across the panel is that where we are, or are we still struggling just to get IP equipment? Gentlemen, where are we at this point?
So I'll say our experience in systems is that there's probably an IP version of most things out there, but whether it's an IP version of the thing you want from the vendor you want, it's still a few vendors are ahead and behind of the getting there. But by and large, I'd say in the video world, all the major players have 2110 senders, receivers, that's all working. They, by and large, mostly support NMOS now as well. A few exceptions occasionally, but getting there. On the audio world, it's actually been a little bit slower for whatever reason, so the pure audio products aren't necessarily all, doing full NMOS and everything yet, but they all at least say the words and are getting there. They're, there's nobody who's in active denial and saying, we will never do that. Whereas a year or two ago, there might have been.
Yeah, what are those stages? Anyway, anger, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, so when we, in the TTG project now, TTG went on the air a year ago, so kind of, my timing is probably 6 months before that. I think mostly John's right. You probably can provide pretty much everything, but
you know, when you design a system, you generally plan all the pieces and then you wait for it to be delivered. So, you know, I won't name the vendor, but we had a particular vendor of a major piece of equipment that we were talking to throughout and talking about, you know, specifications. Karl knows this well. And about 2 weeks before it was supposed to be delivered, they called and said, we've decided we're not going to make a 2110 product in that range anymore. And we're like, wait a minute, we have a signed purchase order, we have a, so, you know, all kinds of things can happen. It was a bit of an adjustment, shall we say, for that particular project. But, you know, be more positive about it. I think that almost everything we ordered came, almost everything worked. Well, everything did work. It just didn't necessarily, as John said, you know, some of the NMOS stuff was still a bit immature. Now, that's a year and a half ago. That's a long time, and I think that's probably solved because, of course, in a lot of cases, you know, Karl's team, who integrated the facility, we work with those vendors to educate them. So my guess is you wouldn't have the kind of problems we had a year and a half ago.
Yeah, I think too that what's happened is that there's probably an IP solution that meets the 2110 requirements, in most cases the NMOS requirements across the board. That was dramatically different 18 to 24 months ago. The other part is that the vendors are very, providers of equipment and so forth, are very cooperative with both the client and, in the case of a system integrator, with us as well, which I think is equally as important as being compliant to IP, because you're going to run across little things, little tiny things that, you know, only experience will allow you to find that if you're one of the team, but if you've got 3 members of that team, it works out a lot better. Somebody's going to know the answer, and there are a lot of improvements.
I would say, for me, some of the things I'm seeing is that, yes, you can find a lot of vendors that do 2110, that some of them do NMOS, but a lot of them just kind of, it's almost like they just strapped a gateway onto their piece of equipment. It wasn't manufactured to be native 2110. I mean, it can do 2110, but so I think there's still a ways to go there. The other thing I'm finding is, even when we did WTTG, the goal was it was greenfield, so you should be able to do 2110 everywhere. You can't. There's a lot of things. If you want X, you're working with the vendor and you say, how are we doing on 2010? Well, we're looking at this, we're working at this. I mean, for me, a big area I'm looking at right now is, as we want to get away from special servers that are dedicated to a specific purpose. And so we're looking at how can we do VMware or other virtualized technologies, but then the next question is, if we want to do that, how do we do 2110 in those virtualized technologies so that we don't have to have, you know, 10 servers for 10 things that really don't need that?
I think the good thing is we're past the early adopter phase, which I think was challenging, especially in the control plane. And I think from an industry perspective, the data plane interconnect has been astoundingly good from very early on. Very few issues, apart from possibly a few wide, narrow sender things in the very early days. But the control plane has taken longer to get there. It's been, the adoption has been there. And if you look at it from a holistic level, as we heard from the education session at the very beginning of today, there is still almost a pipe dream of where NMOS will take, you know, control and parameterization in the longer term. But I think we're now delivering as business as usual, and that, to me, that's a great thing. There's far less challenges come back from the field saying this just isn't working, or how on earth do we do this? It's actually, there's a lot of handle turning in delivering a business as usual, which I think is reassuring in terms of the maturing of the technology.
Yeah, I just want to be clear when I'm talking about the TGG experience. Andy is right. The core stuff all worked. You know, the audio, video moved. That the problem really was more in control than anything else, by far. I mean, order of magnitude difference.
So, I'm sorry, somebody?
I was just going to say that, and I would agree that audio is probably the most complicated of the whole model.
Do you want to
Indeed, but it
follow
does
that
work.
a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you've got an
These
audio
mics
industry
are
that's
picking you
been...
up, by the way, just for everybody. These mics are picking you up quite well, so
okay.
you don't have
to
move it, but
swallow
you
it.
don't have to. No, you're good. Go ahead.
If you think about audio's evolution, even before there was a 2110 world, they were quite far down the road.
Right.
Take Ember Plus as one example, Dante is another example, the Ravenna approaches to things. They were pretty much in place. They're the ones that have had to change and adopt to meet the whole ecosystem and to get it to work right. And we're getting much further down the road than we were the last 18 months or so. I've seen numerous changes like that. That said, pick any of the aforementioned protocols or methodologies, there are some pretty interesting hooks and capabilities that are unique to that particular platform. And as long as you understand that and design it into the system, you could literally build in isolation a 2110-30 and not use -30 if you wanted to. And that's what we're finding, particularly with facilities that are operating while we're making, or building the plane while it's in flight sort of thing. That's critical to know.
Well, and I think, Karl, that point highlights and perhaps supports the initial hypothesis of this panel, right? Because when manufacturers are working just to develop their own product, then they can maybe not necessarily worry about how these particular other audio formats or other audio control methodologies or whatever happen to work. But when this stuff shows up at a loading dock, when equipment shows up at a loading dock at a facility, and there are already things, other formats in there. I mean, this first started showing up for me with Canon cameras at CNN, as news formats and RAW. All sorts of things come into real-world facilities that aren't necessarily kind of in the mindset initially, maybe as you're doing a new product development. So potentially needing to think about how things like, I don't know, Ember Plus and NMOS or Dante and the SMPTE standards are really going to work in real-world environments is an indication maybe of the maturity of and maybe the real challenges of doing a facility integration at this point.
So much of it too is marketplace driven, depending upon where you are. If you're predominantly a production studio in the LA, Hollywood, Burbank areas and things like that, you've got a whole different set of parameters you deal with in a television station, WTTG for example, or a major network that's moving 4 entities together into one building. Every one of those things have serious considerations, and as long as you understand the principles and the concepts behind each of the capabilities and protocols, it's not impossible to build an architecture, ecosystem, I guess, better word, that works very, very well. In fact, some cases works better than SDI.
Sure. Well, and I think as an additional example of kind of the maturity of the discussion within the AMWA, they're talking about how does NDI work with NMOS. That just reflects a maturity in the discussion, right? And I think there was a discussion earlier about RIST and Zixi and so on, right? These things, when you're building real-world systems, these multiple formats, some proprietary, some open, are going to exist. And ultimately, figuring out how those things work together is going to befall the user or the system integrator. To kind of take a brief, maybe brief, we'll see, detour. So everything, if you're building IP systems in the cloud, is easy, right? Because this is a discussion, this panel is not just about 2110 NMOS, it's also about cloud, because it's IP systems, and I mean the cloud is largely footed on IP, so everything's great, I hear.
Well, what you been smoking?
Who's cloud and where?
Okay, well, let's go there.
See, I'm going to cheat and say to you, Brad, the TTG facility was built before it was practical to put anything in the cloud.
So there you go, you
is.
get a pass.
So that's my answer.
Yeah, right. But I think
Scapegoat.
No, I mean, there's
but to go down this road, right, if you're working with a lot of different media companies, and they have substantial IP deployments in cloud too, right? Mm-hmm. So how's that going, and what about the world between, the 2110 NMOS stuff, the cloud, how's that?
So I see the cloud deployments moving sort of from the consumer backward. So if you think about things like, OTT streaming to consumers, a lot of the encoding, packaging, ad serving, that stuff's in the cloud. And it's stood up and it's scripted and it's, there's a lot of deployment tools for it. As you move back up the chain into the, say, linear playout environments, things like that, many of the linear channels you watch at home come from the cloud today. If they don't have a live integration, there's probably a 50–60% chance they come from the cloud. If they do have a live integration, it's a smaller chance only because there's some human-in-the-loop latency concerns and so forth. And some of those tend to be the higher profile channels that are just naturally kind of later adopters of fancy new technology. So that wave is coming backward from the consumer, whereas most of the other deployments we do in the world of television tend to be driven, outbound, right? But that's what I see is the cloud deployments are coming from the consumer up the chain because it's new. That's stuff that all needed to be built, and it's by and large was to begin with all software based in the first place.
I think one of the things that's, to answer that question and partly the previous one as well, one of the things that's changed a lot in the last 24 months as opposed to the previous 4 years, apart from this being off the ramp of early adopter, is we're now starting to seeing distributed systems built. So the first facilities that were deployed were, standalone, almost doing a facility with IP rather than with SDI, which arguably from a cost benefit saving, apart from the format agnosticism, had not that much benefit. But as we're now moving to deploy a lot of distributed systems, then we leverage the advantage of shared infrastructure, shared real estate, shared people resources on a almost unbounded wide area capability. And in terms of your answering the cloud element, I think we're seeing two different types of cloud, public cloud and private cloud infrastructure. Right. So that saving of resources by centralizing processing is actually happening in serious amounts now. So the concept of actually pooling resources and actually having them available to a number of locations, in an arbitrated manner is highly successful, and that's leveraging real cost saving by doing that, as well as the fact that the people can be co-located. The actual pure cloud, as John said, I think that's migrating back. We'll cover a little bit more of this tomorrow in terms of where we want to go on this. I think there's inevitably going to be probably some degree of hybrid of, the necessity to have some elements at the acquisition/event location, and a lot of it either in private or public data center environments where you actually can coalesce your actual processing. But that's the big change that I've seen in the last 2 years.
Yeah, and an interesting aspect of, I guess you would say, public cloud is actually, it comes back to control, right? Because a lot of those public cloud vendors have their APIs. They're not standard open, so to speak, APIs, but they have essentially the same market effect as those, right? I mean, so it will be interesting to watch the development of that and the open versus the main vendor APIs, and to see how that control aspect of that works out.
Yeah.
It's a watch this space kind of situation at this point.
And a big plug for the VSF work, which is ongoing on the GC, CC, CG elements, especially in the CC bit, which is where we're focusing at the moment, ably headed by Mr. M here, looking at how what it's going to be possible to standardize and how much we can reach in and actually define interoperability points within the compute.
Right.
But I think you do have to be careful. You use the word open in there, and there's a lot of just because something is published doesn't mean it's open, right?
Well,
if you stood up your own cloud and cloned Amazon's APIs and used them in your cloud, you would find out they're not open.
Well, that's what I meant was, let me be specific, and thank you for calling me out on that. I thought I said it specifically, but I didn't. For example, open and community, developed in a community type control specifications, and specifications that are developed by Amazon or Microsoft or you know, Google, that are published but not developed in a community environment. And so for me, what I was saying is it will be interesting to see the interplay between those two. And just to Karl's point, using any large, well, even medium-sized broadcaster you talk to, but the ones that immediately come to mind would be BBC and Turner or CNN. I know Warner Media, Warner Discovery, sorry, I'm running down the list.
We might be.
Yeah, okay, yeah, you might be one, are getting huge benefits from using advanced functionality that's baked into some of those published but, you know, proprietary APIs. There are definitely benefits to that. And
Sure.
again, part of the real discussion right now, when you get to a systemization discussion, is that those darn users are just going to implement the thing that gets them to monetize content the most efficiently, and you know, that's that. So anyhow, Mike, I think you were going to say
Well, no, I
some
was
things
just gonna-
about the question about
I was just
cloud
going to
and
mention
how it's going.
the things that I've observed or heard for us is a big important thing for us is, you know, on-prem versus cloud, being able to go back and forth, that type of thing. And I think what we found is you can go from one prem to another prem easily. You can go from one cloud to another cloud easily, but to go between on-prem and cloud is a little bit more of a challenge in terms of synchronization, timing, that type of thing. And not saying it can't be fixed, it's just, it's hard.
Mike, can
And
you
we had the
talk-
same issues with Remy when we went in that direction for a number of years, not necessarily by choice, but driven that way. There were the same kind of things got addressed. And you know, at the point where we have sort of universal interfaces, when you go ground to cloud, cloud to cloud, cloud back to ground, hybrid, multi-cloud, whatever you want to call them, when we get to that level, this is just going to flow in the same way that we got to IP to a level that we weren't building one-offs every single time. I can tell you, without any duress at all, every project we did for the first 3 years was a one-off. No two systems were like, we're narrowing that down. It's really becoming a flat plane for IP. And I think that's what cloud's going to have to do in order to get it fully adopted.
Yeah, although one of the things that one of the very strong feedbacks I've gotten, the AMWA has cranked up a users group. And one of the first things that came out of that was a request for some playbooks or some, you know, patterns that could be maybe identified, and the technical parameters of those patterns could be published so that people could reuse them. So I think that pain is pretty common.
Right.
But Mike, I want to go back to what you said for just a second, and then Richard, I got you in the queue. You said challenges were timing and something. Can you go into a little more detail? Timing and synchronization. Can you go into a little more detail, please?
So say you're doing master control on-prem and you're backing it up in the cloud, and for whatever reason you need to switch from one to the other. Getting those two synchronized so you can actually even just switch between them is challenging in the timing. It's a lot easier to time two facilities and get them in phase than it is to time between a facility and the cloud. And so that's something for us as we look at things. Sometimes when you get the bill back from the cloud, it might be less expensive to have a private cloud on-prem than it is to use a public cloud, but you still want the public cloud for DR or when you need extra capacity, that kind of thing. So you need to be able to easily transition between one and the other. And that's what I've seen as more of a challenge.
Okay, and DR is what?
Disaster recovery.
Okay.
Sorry.
Great. Richard?
So that's not what I was going to say, but thank you for that, because there's the plug for John's group. And again, this is exactly what the VSF is trying to solve some of those problems. The point I wanted to make, Brad, is, you know, you think about it, this is like any adoption of any new technology, right? In the beginning, it's all proprietary and people are trying to figure it out and people aren't educated, all that, and everybody thinks they've got an edge. Every manufacturer wants to, you know, sell their products, so tries to have an edge or some differentiation. And then slowly over time, as people become educated and things become a little more stable, users start to insist that there be more interoperability. And that's exactly where we are. I mean, I'm talking to some of my friends out here in the audience, I predict that you're going to have interoperability between all the cloud services in the next 5 years. Whereas today, it's really hard. But I think in 5 years, customers are going to demand that, as we all recognize we need multi-cloud for a myriad of reasons, which are beyond this topic.
Karl, did you have something you were going to add? I think before I asked Mike the question, you had something.
No, I can't.
No?
I lost, I was paying attention.
Okay, all right, that's no problem. So we've touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to ask specifically, if you remember, we opened the panel with the question of whether this is the phase we're in or not, in terms of now we're building IP systems. But from your guys' perspective, what's different about being in this phase compared to where we were before, where we were working very hard just to get the equipment available? John?
So I'll say the biggest change in the last couple of years is about expectations. When we first started doing this stuff, people were so happy that it worked at all. Right?
Oh, the lights came on. Yes.
You know, and now.
And I'm sorry, John.
Now
Hold
we're
on
in a
just a
different zone.
Cyril, Gene, we love you guys. Go ahead.
So now, you know, we're in a different zone. Now we're in a zone where people are saying, you know, it's even just achieving parity of in SDI, we could do this, now we could do it in IP. No, we've passed that point too. Now we're in a zone of expectation where people want to achieve the benefits, the tangible benefits they can see that they should get from IP, which they were never going to get in SDI. I can build a facility that scales and have 6 studios and 4 control rooms and any camera can go anywhere and all this. Great. But I need a control plane in the facility that actually can make use of that and can organize this room for this show and that room for that show and do all this stuff on the fly. And that's been, as an industry, always been the domain of, oh yeah, for $1 zillion and a lot of customization, you can create a whole software layer that does that. People are now hoping to get more democratized systems at that level of the management plane. And that's something where the work and the standards for that is just beginning, and that's, I think, the next battle of the industry is about building systems that meet those expectations at that level.
People want what we promised IP was going to bring.
Dang it.
No,
It's your fault and my fault. We said that.
I understand.
We said it was all going to be better with IP.
It enables it, but it doesn't deliver it.
Yes,
well,
that's the point.
I mean, I'm even
Yeah.
starting to see that in some of the implementations we have where, before it was router panel, source destination take, and then you have to bring up 10 other interfaces to configure everything.
Yep.
Where now, when you push 2 buttons on the panel, not only does it configure everything, but it brings up all of the information on that touch screen for what you're actually trying to do. The information you need when you need it, and that is actually, it's very refreshing to see that.
Yeah, I kind of call it dynamic repurposing, because it's actually being able to reuse all of those physical real estate, people, resources dynamically in an a technology abstracted, user-friendly way. That's essentially what we're at. It's flexibility is what people are after in terms of the way they actually use the stuff, and IP natively is capable of doing that. And I think we've got a long way down enabling that, but there's still further to go to make full use of that IP flexibility.
And it's an interesting thing I observed the other day at one of the TV stations. We have this huge, nice Sony switcher control panel and everything. And I asked, do we ever use those buttons? No, it's all automation. Nobody even knows how to manually run that panel anymore.
That's probably okay.
It is, but then why even have the panel?
Until the automation fails.
Except the panel costs a lot of money.
Panel's expensive.
Well, and the switcher
Takes
to
a lot of real
support all
estate.
those MEs you didn't use, yeah.
But to just tack on Andy's thing, and I'll let Mike will remember this. I challenged him, got to be 5-6 years ago. Our first IP concept was we were going to build a room that had screens and keyboards, and nothing in it was dedicated, and he was going to make it all dynamic. What was your term, Andy?
Dynamic repurposing.
Dynamic repurposing. That was the whole idea, that somebody somewhere up in the sky said, okay, today Mike's going to be the TD for the San Francisco game or whatever it was, and he'd walk up to the door, swipe his ID card, the room would automatically configure itself for this San Francisco game, right, and so on. And I'm going to say Mike got about halfway there.
Yeah,
In my time, I don't know.
yeah, I think
Then
so.
you went to work for Disney, so I don't know what happened.
Well, and I'll say I saw some things there where, they even had it where when you set the room up, the phones actually changed their personality to
Yep.
match.
That's right.
So, I mean, the technology's there, it's putting it together, it's spending the $1 zillion that John was talking about.
Yeah, I only gave you half a zillion, so
Yeah,
Well, you got half a system.
that's what you got.
Well, so tomorrow I'll be giving a presentation on on a dynamic media system architecture that's the result of a consulting project that I did for a European broadcaster, large European broadcaster. And what I can tell you is that the depth you have to go to build these sorts of systems we're talking about is pretty extreme. And I tried the best I could to try and condense what that project was about into 30 minutes, and it just scratches the surface. And hopefully, if my article for the SMPTE Journal gets published, there'll be more detail there. And I can tell you, even that just scratches the surface. So when you look at the size of the problem that media companies are trying to solve, if you're talking about something that's truly dynamic at scale, it's pretty large. But there is some work that's been done to kind of break that down and layer some of the technologies that are needed into some kind of hopefully useful basic building blocks. And I don't know what, maybe there's some additional work that VSF and AMWA together, or maybe working with SMPTE or whatever, can do to advance the parts of that would be good to have public or standardized. My observation, though, was kind of based on the comments that I had earlier in one of the earlier presentations, which is, from my perspective, if you're going to build these systems, it's a different skill set that the users need to have within their environment to really be able to deliver the sort of functionality that they're asking for. And John, I've heard you talk about this before, and kind of the education of users as you've gone through this process. So maybe we could transition to that as a question for the panel. What's your observation of kind of where the users have been, and I'm talking generically, in the discussions that you've had with users as we've moved through from, have you got a product and does it do this and check the boxes, to actually, I want to build a system, I'm serious about this.
Well, so I feel like as an industry, we are struggling and trying and sometimes getting there to change the procurement model of systems. Because it used to be you could write a spec for, we're going to have 3 control rooms and 4 cameras and 5 studios and 4 lights, and you build this detailed spec and you hand it to Diversified and Beck and whoever, and they bid on it, and you pick one and they show up and they turn it up and they hand you the keys at the end of the project. Here you go, done. And
Sounds
maybe
a
there
lot
was a
like
punch
waterfall.
list about a light bulb or something, but by and large, it was just like build, handover, done. And these systems are not that. These systems that we're describing now are you work together for years. There's, it's never, there's no concept of finished. There's, phases and deployments and updates and a very different model. And yet there's still some guy over in contracts and procurements that's looking to have a contract that says who's going to do what. We don't even have words to describe the relationship of the parties that work in a contract that, an old school procurement person would agree to. And that's part of what we're struggling with, is finding a new set of relationships between the parties, between the equipment makers, the software developers, the vendors, the end customers, and inevitably the larger end customers need to take on some amount of technical ownership of the execution of the project and be involved, have people that really are capable of picking up the project and owning its daily upkeep. And it's going to take years to get there, but we have to, that's, I think, the non-technical challenge we face as an industry, is moving to a different model of relationship of all the parties.
I'll say, for me, my observation has been it's really hard to find someone at most users that have the skill capability to actually take ownership of a project like that.
I agree. No, it's a staffing and HR challenge all the way along.
Yeah.
And you can learn by reading all the details and the specs and so forth. You can go through the exercises of putting those parts and pieces on paper. What you don't realize is that until you put your hands on it, you really don't know what you've got. And that's what we find in every single project is you find in an organization a champion that's going to take this on, it's going to do all the research on their own. And by the way, they don't have a full-time day job. That's the hard part. But, you know, eventually they're going to learn pieces and parts of it. I watched in one project where an experienced IT engineer from the financial side was hired by an organization to come in and literally become their IT specialist. And the guy had to learn all the capabilities of 2110. He had to learn the control architecture of the providing vendor. He had to learn test equipment, the prisms, the leaders, the packet storms, all of those things that you see down on our floor down here. And he did a really good job of it. And without him, I think the project could have been headed for a disaster. The unfortunate part is the gentleman left the company, and they were back to square one trying to find not only another person, but a person with that experience, which you learn by doing, hands-on. And I think that's an important element to understand, because I'll be honest, we've got the 2110 switch architectures and controllers and things down, but then the curveballs come. Oh, we need NDI. That's a really important feed. Where's the redundancy and resiliency in it? Well, what if we just switched to NDI when we had a failure? Remember the 10x1 push button switchers and the SDI master controls? NDI is the solution for that. It's inexpensive, but it's another network, it's another construction concept that you have to do, and not everybody's willing to take all of those things on. There's an expectation that IP is just not going to fail.
Yeah, well,
Brent, I think, you know, this is an interesting conversation. I think part of it is we're spoiled because SDI has been around, somebody help me, 40 years, 30 years anyway, whatever.
Yeah.
And, you know, we all speak each other's language, right? You don't have to write it in the spec. No reasonable, you know, provider would miss that kind of thing.
Right.
And now we're all sort of learning. And the one thing I want to talk about on that is, you know, think of the WTTG project. Now here we are, it's Fox. It's a station in Washington, D.C., a big market, right? A big station, very successful station. And we were able to hire one person to do a project to build a television station with 2 studios, 15 edit rooms, a huge newsroom, the whole facility. Station does 10 hours of news a day, just to give you a sense of the level of production that's going on. And there's one poor engineer who was hired to do it, and that's all the station could afford. And as much as they tried to train people and things like that, you guys can already answer those questions. I don't have to describe the challenges they had getting that station up and keeping it on the air. Now, you know, it's a good staff, and they haven't had any major problems, I'm pleased to say. But you know, if I could quote, do it over again, you know, I would have tried to find a way to find some money to hire more than one person. But the real key, and one of the other earlier panelists, and I've forgotten who, I apologize, used the phrase DevOps style. You know, trying to get the people who are going to maintain that plant involved in its actual construction and configuration is what you have to do. And we need vendors to help with that from the standpoint of being able to give people knowledge or transfer knowledge. But we also have to find the time to do it. And it's a huge challenge when you start talking about things like television stations and small post houses. They can't afford to do it. A big network may be able to, and even that sounds debatable in the case you described, right?
Yeah.
But this is a huge challenge. We're going through a change, and I think people are in denial that it's a change. And, you know, based upon the earlier conversation, look, we promised all these great features that IP is going to bring. We need to recognize the fact that, okay, you're going to get savings for that. You got to apply some of those savings up front. And I know that's very easy for me to say here, and it's nigh impossible for anybody to get past their chief financial officer. But it's, you know, it's the reality of trying to make such a major change in operations. And it's all new technology, but it's also technology that's different, right? Everything's software based. And look, when I started in this, the software meant you pulled out the plug board and you moved the jumpers around, right? I mean, so you're trying to get people who hopefully are a little younger than me, that have a little more flexibility, but you're trying to make that kind of transition, and it's a big, big challenge. And I have to say, in the case of TGG, I'll give the guys there tremendous credit. They really killed themselves. They worked day and night to make it work. But that's the problem. They had to.
So, Andy, I know you've got something to say. I would encourage you guys to be part of this conversation, and I know a number of people in this crowd, and I know you have burning questions to ask these people. So if you do, please move up to the mic and ask. In the meantime, Andy.
Yeah, so one question I have is what level should we expect the users to need to have of understanding the underlying technology? We put a phenomenal amount of energy into this abstraction at the moment, you know, because the underlying technology is so much more immensely complex than it used to be. And at one end, you've got the creatives, the actual content producers, actually getting glimpses of what's possible in terms of the flexibility. Right. And they're driving and pulling to do the creative, to do those wild things that they're now seeing are possible. But I think on all of this, whilst you need to have ownership within plants, within facilities, you know, anchor people that are able to actually understand the tech to some level, I think as the vendor community, and I think we're getting better at it, we have to provide the tools, to abstract the users so they really can stay at the creative level rather than having to get to the tech level, but also the diagnostics and the other tools so that the technology support teams within those organizations don't have to dive that low that often in the way they're actually supporting things as well. And I think we're still on the road on there, but I think, you know, we're getting better as an industry in doing that.
Yeah, definitely. And Karl, please.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Andy, because I've spent the last 3 or 4 months developing what is the second level of educational process for our company. We have 250 plus engineers. Of those, maybe 10% of them are going to get charged with being a lead engineer on an IP project somewhere in the next year or 2 years of their career. Most of these projects take a year plus to birth, sell, finance, implement, particularly if it's a new greenfield facility, a lot longer than that. So it's not unusual at all that they'll have 18 months before they'll probably get their hands on a piece of gear and actually turn it up, if you will. So I was astounded about the number of YouTube videos that are out there that go from 2 minutes or 5 minutes to 7 minutes to hours and a half things. A lot of them have Wes standing up in front of the camera, leading them. But there's a lot of good material there. And I put that together for our company because everyone was kind of doing their own thing based upon what they had experienced or who they were talking to in the past. There's got to be a harmony in this industry. And one of your topics was what could VSF do? Right. I think education is the prime thing we need to do in this organization. It could be a completely separate group. AMWA could certainly harmonize with that and others, but you know, just to have a presentation once a month or something like that to the industry, they're not going to get it. They have to be able to go back to a library and say, what does RPC mean, or what does XYZ mean, and why is it important to me, because I'm going to run across it. So.
I'll take that a step further. I was actually at WTTG last week talking to their engineers. They've got a couple open positions they can't fill because nobody can find people that want to work on site. Everyone wants to work remote. But you know, we were talking how do they improve to be able to support these things? Well, their particular invitation is based on Arista. I said you should take the Arista certified engineer class. But my thing is, why don't we have a 2110 certified engineer class or something like that? to take what you're, where someone can go out on their own and say, okay, I'm certified, I know enough about 2110 to be dangerous or not.
Looks like Wes is going to run off and do that.
Wes
Yeah,
is-
Wes is making some notes.
He's going to go fix his
No,
website, and he'll have
that's
that course
exactly what-
launched tonight.
That's exactly what we
Camera,
did,
yeah.
and we've organized this for tier levels of experience, and there's a reward. You take the courses, you check it. There might be a follow-up test. We haven't done that part yet, but that's a merit, something that can be used to encourage you to go to the next level in your organization. That's the only way you get
could
people
easily
to pay
have
attention.
2 or 3 levels where you start
Yeah.
out here and move up, but it would be, it'd be huge for an engineer that wants to learn it, because I get lots of engineers that come up to me and say, hey, can you teach me about 2110? I was like, yes, I can, but it would be great if I could say, go take this class and then let's talk.
Well, there are some things out there like that, Mike, of course, and maybe someone can help me on this. I know SB has started on this. I don't know how far they are, but as you know, they have their certifications. My understanding is they have a 2110 program, either in flight or about to be in flight.
Well, and I would expect it would be a moving target, because just, our discussion up here, how things, when we built our first 2110, NMOS wasn't ready, so it's purely, one way, but as NMOS and the various other things come on, it's a whole new set of things you have to learn.
Well, one thing that's interesting about this topic is I think a number of organizations have come to this realization about education being key at the same time. So we know that Joel and the guys at the SMPTE spend a lot of time on education. SBE is working on it. Ames has identified that it's a key activity that they want to push. So with basically kind of a scattergun approach to this, I hate to say that because I know each one of those organizations is trying to figure out how best to address the industry. There's obviously a need for this. How do you maybe bring that together? Yeah, maybe so, Richard. Richard said the Joint Task Force on Network Media. That may be a solution. But a lot of people are working on that. And I know that both on the VSF and the AMWA side, we've said that we would contribute technical content to that to try and help. But, I think what you're saying, Karl, is how do you get, or maybe it was you, Mike, that said that, how do you get beyond the engineer who's just out there, searching on, I don't know, RTCP or PTP or whatever, and pulling up random videos that they can find versus something that actually progresses them through something that gets them to a logical level of education that's useful, right?
Yeah, and we talked about hands-on earlier. That's the way you really learn. So how do you provide a lab for, because really if you can be in a class all day long and learn everything, but until you actually really push the buttons and do the stuff, you don't really learn very much. You really need hands-on.
Yeah, you can only take it so far before, you got to get behind the wheel, put the key in the ignition and turn it on.
Right, but I think, as an industry, we've introduced new technologies over and over again, right? So at the rollout of digital transmission, Harris or whoever, it was Harris, built a truck, at the DTV Express, and it went from city to city, and it had a whole TV station set up in there, and it was a tremendously expensive undertaking, right? But we sold a lot of transmitters, so it just kind of worked out.
Yeah, there's always a mission.
There's a mission, everybody's got to eat. So, but I'm sure that at the beginning of D1, there was a similar thing. Not everybody understood D1. If you think back to, 1989 and trying to get parallel D1 working, well, good luck to you. It was hard. And in a sense, the technology got so good that we've all forgotten that it was hard.
Yeah, it was, but in that case, for me, it was Sony showed up, right, and there were training courses, and before that, Tektronix had a lot of training courses about how to deal with analog video.
And so the onus a little bit is back on the vendors to do some of this.
So
That's right.
I will just give credit to a guy, Jim Oken, anybody who knows him, who's chief engineer in the business, has a little truck. He's driving around the country with his wife, honest to God. He went out and bought like what is the big Econoline replacement, kind of thing. It's not a big truck like the DTV Express was. He's doing this on his own. And
With like
in
2110
retirement-
and stuff?
Yeah, he's got 2110 in it, he's got NDI in it, and he's trying to educate people, and he literally drives from station to station like a hobo almost, you know?
That sounds
Well,
really
I think we
appealing.
do need something like that, though. My son works for an IndyCar racing team, and so I went to a race, and of course, it's got a truck there that NBC has taken their feet off of, so, you know, hi, I'm nobody. Can I just poke my head in your truck and ask some questions, right? And so got to the president of the company, and I'm asking questions, and basically, you know, the point was, I have an SDI truck. It works perfectly fine doing IndyCar. I don't know how I would get to an IP infrastructure with what I do. Right, so maybe that's the path, and for people who are, you know, the large entities, whether they're broadcasters or whatever, they can blaze their own path, but someone like that, or, you know, or any kind of mid-level TV station, they need somebody like that to show up in a Econoline and say, here, let me show you some things, or something from SBE, or something that BSF puts together out of what Karl is talking about. But we are definitely at a point where you can see, you know, we can all probably, especially, you know, up here on this panel, name the 12 or 15 people that are working in stations that you could say, yeah, this person could build a system on their own, this could, and then you fairly quickly run through that list at top level stuff, and on down, it's a real challenge. So I think the industry's trying to address it. I do think it's important for the VSF to talk about what role we might play. We have a board meeting coming up tomorrow, so maybe we can carry this discussion forward in the board meeting tomorrow. But
Good thing there are no board members on this panel.
yeah, well, that's a sore spot. But
Bunch
yeah,
of
well,
closures
no,
there, yeah.
there are. Wait. Oh, look at the time. Somehow magically we have chewed up an hour. But to go just a little over, any closing thoughts before we sign off, Richard? We'll start at your end and come on down. Any final thoughts?
Look, I still think the big thing here is education, as we just finished talking about, and I think I made my plea already, so I'll let others talk.
I'll say the enduring benefit of the IP showcases and some equivalent events is the creation of that huge set and repository of YouTube videos that are, you know, I run into people all over the world that are like, oh, I watched your video. I was like, great, thanks. It's a really, it's a cheap and cheerful good way to learn basics of what all this stuff is. I don't think we all planned it to work out as well as it has, but that enduring legacy is, you know, is good. And how do we make the next level of those courses that are a little more about, you know, a little deeper and a little more, you know, narrow? I don't know, but we will.
Thank you.
Yeah, but when people say to me, oh, I've watched your video, they then say, and I know how to make a cup of tea now. No.
Yes, there is that.
But
So they did listen to it.
they did
Yeah, they did listen to that part.
Yeah, as opposed to the coffee one, which got no views at all.
Oh, come on now.
But it's worthwhile just to see the beard.
It is.
Absolutely. Yeah, that hair
I
is
do miss
something
it.
I'm so jealous of. But the
Actually, pour over is the way to make coffee, well, or the AeroPress, but that's a whole we digress. Please.
But I think the serious point of like the conclusion of where we're heading here is that the basics are now in place. I think the foundation stones, both in the data plane and control plane, are working well. There's room to go. But now it's that leveraging true benefit for the creatives and the people that want to save money and cost manage. Both of those ends of the spectrum. I think that's actually really happening now, and that's for me the most exciting thing.
Yeah, and we didn't even have a chance to get into this, Andy, but there's also the transition that's inevitable that is coming, which is from IP to IT. And you talk about the creatives being able to really leverage something. When we get to that, it's going to be an explosion, so it'll be an interesting time. Karl?
I think the industry, and particularly users that are in this audience or those that are thinking about building it, keep an open mind. The IP has so many more capabilities if you keep your mind open as to where it could go.
than we've had in previous architecture. So there's lots of neat opportunities here.
Absolutely. Mike?
I'm going to take a step back to where we were talking about automation and dynamicity, or whatever the word you
I like that
Dynamic
a lot.
repurposing.
dynamic repurposing, and say, and I'm trying to remember the number, the IS, the one where we're going to replace SNMP. Is it IS 12?
I suppose so.
It doesn't have a number yet.
Anyway, doesn't have a number yet.
Okay, but I see that as SNMP is almost like a legacy protocol these days, and having a good API that's flexible for all of these different vendors to be able to start integrating the things and provisioning, because it seems like I spend half my time trying to reverse engineer this vendor's API to be able to get it to do what I want, or this, I mean, and John knows I've worked with you on different things and asked you to do things that were different, but it worked well. And so to me, I look at some of those things are going to be really important as we go forward, to be able to have a much cleaner and easier way to do some of these integrations, so it's not always a science project.
Yeah, that thing you're referring to is called the NMOS Control Architecture, NCA,
Yes.
and it's out there on the AMO website.
That's right. All right, and with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for a great hour, great discussion. Thank you.